And on this episode, I'm talking a little bit about someone most of us have never even heard of, but he was actually one of the most prominent influences on the founding generation, on the principles of the American Revolution, a guy named Algernon Sidney. This is a guy who was beheaded for writing a book. He didn't publish it. He wrote the book and kept the papers at home, but they found him in his home. He was beheaded for writing about natural rights, opposing the divine right of kings. He talked about things like consent of the government, self-defense, and things like that at a time where that was not acceptable, of course. So I'm going to share a little history about his life and death. I'm going to point out how Thomas Jefferson actually considered this book the best one ever written, the best elementary introduction to the principles of government ever written, and he said in any language. And so then I'm also going to cover some principles from this book, which was published after his death, called Discourses Concerning Government, of course, on natural rights, consent of the government, governed, self-defense, resistance to tyranny, some precursors to nullification in there, and more. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out. There you're going to find all the archives. We're into our 4th year now, which I think is just amazing because I started the show on a whim, and I love the fact that you guys enjoy geeking out to some of this information as much as I enjoy sharing it with you. So you can find all the archives. On individual episodes like this one today, I'm going to link to all the different source documents that I mentioned. I've got a couple of articles. I've got a bunch of letters from various founders, some speeches, things like that, so you can read and learn more on your own time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we're on the mainstream ones like Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and Twitter, but you may notice someday that we're missing from one of those, so you also want to know all the other ones that we're on, like Odyssey.com, Library.tv, Gab.tv. We're on Minds.com, Brighteon, BitChute, Hyper, MeWe, all over the place. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition on all the usuals, including Podbean, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and elsewhere. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And nothing, absolutely nothing, helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and take a stand for the Constitution and liberty more than the financial faith of our members. And with that, a quick thank you and shout out to just a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. There's John in Missouri, Stephen in North Carolina, Krista here in California, Ava in Texas, Henry in Virginia, and Ian in New York. I can't thank you enough for joining us. And a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat as well, while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream. These mainstream platforms, you think they're going to tell people in advance, but it takes a few minutes, I guess. There's Liberty Revolutionary. Good to see you, buddy. Blue North Wind, Missouri Liberty Alliance, who's doing a lot of great work with Liberty Revolutionary in Missouri. Dixie Strong, Clay Kent, MRGF, Bob Landry in Texas, Richard Banks in Kansas, Murray Ray, Michigan Liberty, Tim Martin, Cheriton Farmer from Salisbury, Missouri. Appreciate you being here as well. Haji in Oakland County, that Liberty gal. And everyone else, Joe, Greg, everyone else. I apologize if I skipped over anybody, but let's get to this info. I think there's a lot to cover, and hopefully this is going to be really interesting. It's a very niche history that we just don't learn about in school. And when we're talking about this book, Discourses Concerning Government, I haven't even read it myself in full. I've read excerpts. There's a lot in there. It's a lot of really interesting stuff. And as you learn about the founding principles, the principles of the revolution, you're like, oh, wow, that's where it came from. I mean, these days, a lot of people think that the founders' ideas came to them in a vacuum, like they just invented this stuff. But no, and as we'll see here, they were really building on a long tradition and expanding on those principles and looking at them and finding ways to apply them. Now, John Adams had once pointed out, and I don't have that letter handy, but he had pointed out in a letter that to mention someone like Algernon Sidney with the English people, you'd be ridiculed. But in America, everyone held that position, the views of these people. But anyways, here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Henry Lee, which I've cited a few times before, but I think is important to set the stage here. Talking about the Declaration of Independence. This is May 8th, 1825. Of course, I linked to these in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And he's talking about how he wasn't trying to cover new ground in the Declaration of Independence. When he was talking to Henry, he's saying, look, this was not a new idea. These concepts that we were covering here. Instead, what we were trying to do was put into beautiful prose, which was Jefferson's obvious skill. He wasn't a good speaker. He was an incredible writer. But instead, what he was trying to do was put into the general mind the widely accepted understanding of these principles of the day. Then let's take a look at what he had to say. The Declaration of Independence was not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. It was intended, Jefferson wrote, to be an expression of the American mind, and to give that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. If you've read a little further on it, Jefferson was not happy. He thinks they butchered out some of the best stuff that he wrote, but still, this was to give it an expression and the proper tone and spirit of the general understanding of the people of the colonies of that time. He says, all its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations and letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public rights. So the books that people learned about government, such as, he says, Aristotle, Cicero, Locke. We know those names. Maybe some of you don't know Locke, but we all know Aristotle and Cicero. And he says, and Sidney, etc. Who the heck is this Sidney? And I had read this a bunch of times, and if it wasn't for my great friend Joe Wolverton, who does this Founder's Recipe, it's been a little while since I've seen him do some posts, but Joe Wolverton has talked about the Founder's Recipe. Where did they get these ideas? Where were the people? Who did they learn from? Because if we want to understand what they understood, we really have to understand what they learned right from the beginning. So Sidney, who the heck is this? I had read this a bunch of times. I'm like, I don't know. And I guess I just wasn't curious enough until I saw Joe talking about this over and over and over a number of years. In fact, we just recently republished an article from Joe from 2009 that highlights 4 of we could call them forgotten influences on the founders, and Algernon Sidney was the first one that he covered. I think it's Joe's favorite. He says, the historical documents which you mention as in your possession ought to all be found, and I'm persuaded you will find to be corroborative of the facts and principles advanced in the Declaration. Again, Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Here's somebody else talking about the same type of thing. Benjamin Franklin in 1750, in Poor Richard's Almanac, he's commemorating the death of Sidney. Here he is on the 7th of this month, 1683, I think it's December, was the Honorable Algernon Sidney, Esquire, beheaded, charged with a pretended plot. We often think of the gunpowder treason and plot of Guy Fawkes Day, but there was also Sidney. The founders didn't look so much to Guy Fawkes Day, although they did do an annual celebration in Boston celebrating Guy Fawkes Day, and they did so as well even after the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect. But this was a big one as well. And the fact that Franklin included this in the Poor Richard's Almanac is a big one. He says, but whose chief crime was writing an excellent book entitled Discourses on Government, or you can see some versions called Discourses Concerning Government. He says, a man of admirable parts and great integrity. Thomson calls him the British Cassius. Now, we should know Cassius as the guy who was one of the instigators of the plot to assassinate Caesar. He was covered by Shakespeare. He killed himself with the same dagger supposedly years later. So this is a guy of great tradition. Cassius, they considered, or Benjamin Franklin considered Sidney to be the American Cassius. And here's a list of an inventory of Ben Franklin's library, his books, the important stuff you're supposed to read as of 1781. It was written quite a bit in his own hands. And the 6th thing on there, he's got, the first thing is a bunch of resolutions from the Continental Congress from 74 through 1780. Then he's got 3 dictionaries, and then one I don't know, Gree. I don't know that one, but now I need to look into it. And then the next one is Sidney's book on government. Franklin thought this was incredibly important. And then James Madison published a list of books proper for Congress, which is, I think, in the annals of the congressional history somewhere, but here we find it on archives.gov. Also listed Sidney on government as basically required reading. Here's Thomas Jefferson in a letter of 1804 to Mason Locke Weems, December 13th of that year. He says, he's talking about this book. He says, it is probably the best elementary book of the principles of government as founded in natural right, which has ever been published in any language. So why have we never heard about this? Well, of course, we all go through government-run schools or in general government-approved private schools as well. And they don't really teach us about this type of history. They don't teach us about the principles of natural rights, of liberty, of consent of the government. They teach us dates and wars and facts and names and stuff like that. We're supposed to be able to just recite stuff for a multiple choice quiz, but we're not really given, the education system isn't really education. We're not really given a way to learn. We're not encouraged to look back deep into these principles at all. Unfortunately, now some of you maybe, not me, I definitely was not. So a quick overview of some of the important parts of Algernon Sidney's life here from a 1997 article at FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, which has some great stuff, fee.org, written by a guy named Chris Baker. He says in 1646, I think he was born in 1622. And in 1646, he ended up being elected to what was known as the Long Parliament because it was in session for 11 years. And he writes, the increasingly fanatical Puritans ordered King Charles I's execution in 1649. So he's part of this parliament, and they're going to execute the king. But Sidney actually argued against that. He, as Chris wrote here, he says he always saw justice, never vengeance. But Cromwell ends up dissolving Parliament in 1653. Sidney refuses to leave, so he's already a man of principle. You can't just kick us out. Parliament is representing the people. So he refused to leave his seat until the Lord Protector's troops forcibly removed him. With his life now in danger, he fled to the Netherlands. And that's where I think his most famous quote, well, the one that brought my attention to his work, came up. While he was in Copenhagen at the university, he was asked to sign in the visitor's book, and he wrote, and they say here, with typical spirit, this hand, enemy to tyrants, by the sword seeks calm peacefulness with liberty. So his pen was mightier than the sword. His pen, his writing, was an enemy to tyrants. He was in and out of favor. He was kicked out of the country, came back, in and out over the coming years. And then eventually in 1680, a guy named Robert Filmer published a book called Patriarcha. And this was an argument that absolute monarchy, this was a very popular book at the time, this was the natural form of government existing from the creation. He made the case that fathers govern families and the right to rule passed on to the eldest son. And so therefore a country, the king was the father, the people was his children, and therefore he would pass along to his oldest son the right to rule. Now Sidney penned in response to this, never published it in his lifetime. Maybe he was going to, I don't know the details of that, but this book called Discourses on Government or Discourses Concerning Government, specifically in response to Fillmore. Now you may know a guy named John Locke. His first treatise, where we get kind of the beginning of the Lockean natural rights tradition, was also written to refute this same Fillmore book, Patriarcha. So same concept, same time, same framework. Here from Dave Kopel in an old article at Volokh Conspiracy, he says, starting in 1681, when fears over the Stuarts' totalitarian ambitions grew intense, Sidney, who had returned to England, worked assiduously to organize the overthrow of the Stuarts. Now, he was on board with rebellion, with resistance by the people, as we'll get more of his quotes here, but he wasn't really an assassination kind of guy. So he wasn't necessarily Cassius. Maybe Franklin was wrong on that, or maybe we're actually reading into his motives wrong. I don't actually know, but hopefully I'll get to the bottom of it at some point. In 1683, Dave writes, Sidney was arrested for treason. This was part of something called the Rye House Plot. This was to either put together, and there were different groups in this that were meeting at the Rye House. Some of them wanted to just assassinate Charles. I think it was Charles II at the point. They wanted to assassinate the king. Others wanted to foment a revolution. I think Sidney was on the side of overthrowing the government. And then you can see how kings at that time probably weren't too friendly with this type of stuff. But he was arrested in part of this, so they got a warrant. They went to his home. That was on June 25th, 1683. There was an arrest warrant that they did back then before they searched his house. And during his arrest, his papers were confiscated. So they picked up all of his stuff, including his draft of the book Discourses. This is from Wikipedia. He was tried on November 7th of that year, so a few months later. And William Howard, this guy, was a baron of Escrick. He was the only witness, but the law required to have two witnesses. You had to have two witnesses in order to convict, but they only had one person who was willing to testify against him. But the government wants to prosecute. The government has basically unlimited power, even though there's a parliament and all this stuff. You can dissolve the parliament at will. You can do all this kind of stuff. You can tell people what they can say and think and all this kind of things. What are they going to do? Well, we only have one witness. This guy's got to go down. So, well, his paper's here. We're going to introduce them as a witness. So the government specifically used his manuscript, his unpublished manuscript talking about natural rights and consent of the government as a witness against him. I'm not sure if they asked him. I can imagine like a South Park episode where they put a book up on stage or on the bench, sit him in the chair there and say, hey, what do you have to say about such and such? And then they just read it off. But they specifically used his discourses as his second witness. It's pretty crazy that they would do something like that. Here from Joe Wolverton, he says, as the trial began, the king's solicitors decried Sidney as a false, seditious, and libelous traitors whose writings fomented revolution by inciting the people to rise up in arms against the king. While Sidney denied the charges of fomenting an uprising, and I'm not sure if he was just trying to protect himself, he did not, and this is, I got to give the man credit here, he did not deny that he was an enemy of absolute monarchy, even in this situation where he's getting railroaded. He's certainly probably guilty under what the law is, but he wrote in his book, an unjust law does not need to be obeyed. We heard stuff like that from John Adams, James Otis, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, so many of the founding generation who had obviously read this stuff talking about if they enact a law that we didn't authorize without our consent, we are not bound to obey them. Theophilus Parsons in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, he said, if Congress passes a law that is a usurpation, and I'm paraphrasing, he specifically said, no one is bound to obey it. Anyone is justified, he said, in their resistance. It comes from this great tradition going all the way back to Algernon Sidney. Here from Liberty Fund, which actually has a great publication of the book. They've got a section here that I've read through. Here's one of the things that he had to say. The question is not whether that which is Caesar's should be rendered unto Caesar, because of course that was a very religious time, and it was an easy argument to say, well, that's Caesar's, you got to hand it over. The king, that's the king's property. You're not entitled to that. He says that's not actually the question. He says, for that is to be done to all men. But who is Caesar? And what doth of right belong to him? So he literally just questioned, like, who is rightfully Caesar? Is someone authorized to be the head of the country merely by birthright? He took the position, absolutely no. And then on top of it, what property counts as owned by the government? Most of it that they claim certainly were not. And they say it was questions like this that got Sidney executed for treason in 1689, literally writing those in private. And this is from the introduction to that same book over at Liberty Fund by a guy named Thomas G. West. He says, just government, talking about Sidney's views, just government being instituted by the consent of the governed. Again, this is stuff that we understand from things like the Declaration of Independence. And then when Jefferson says, oh, we're looking back on people like this guy, well, then we can understand their tradition, their understanding, their view, their principles, how it developed over the years. If we actually start looking into it, and I need to read this in full myself. Just government being instituted by the consent of the governed and for ends limited by the natural law. This is a natural rights view. And by the original contract, it follows that the people have a right to overthrow their government when it violates these limits. Of course, we saw that in the Declaration itself as well. This right to revolution, Thomas writes, was the most controversial part of Sidney's teaching. It was denounced at his trial and led directly to his conviction and execution. I'm assuming that they wanted him convicted and executed one way or the other, and it doesn't matter how much he wrote. They got him on a lot of points here. Back to Dave Kopel. He says Sidney's discourses on government could not have been published while the Stuarts sat on the throne. So he was beheaded in 1783. But yet, the freer atmosphere, Dave writes, after the Glorious Revolution allowed posthumous publication. It was originally published, I think, in the 1690s or so. Here, back to Fee. Sidney was a pioneer in natural rights theory. We often think of Locke as being kind of the leading person, but did Jefferson even mention Locke here? He did. Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney were the influence, and etc. So there's others, and we'll get to those in just a moment as well. Where are we here? A pioneer in natural rights theory from Fee. The common nations, he wrote, the common notions of liberty are not from school divines, but from nature, he declared. 'Tis hard to comprehend how one man can come to be master of many. The notion that someone can be master of the people. And I guess we could take the same view that just a small handful of people can be a master over anything and everything. This notion of centralized power, which came up in the years leading to the revolution under the phrase, in all cases whatsoever. If you look at things like the Declaration of Causes for Taking Up Arms by Dickinson and Jefferson on July 6, 1775, they specifically wrote, this is a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, why should we list our injuries in detail? Because they claim the power to bind us in all cases whatsoever. This is an unlimited, arbitrary, despotic power. And this is what Sidney was actually talking about as well. How can anyone have this right over everyone? He says, in summary, he understood that, quote, to depend upon the will of a man is slavery. So if your liberty is on the will of a person and you're hoping that that person is just going to do the right thing or not do the wrong thing with their power, and then you hope that the next person will do the same, this is how Sidney defined being in a state of slavery. And here's a few quotes from the book. Here's section 33. He says, the liberty of a people is the gift of God and nature. Again, this is just a natural rights view that he's pointing out that people don't get their rights from a document. They don't get their rights from a government. It's not a grant. That's a privilege. So if you have to get a permission slip, you're not really exercising liberty. The founders often said things like, what liberty we have if by their decree, they can take away our property, they can take away our stuff without our consent. That is not a state of freedom. That is a state of slavery. Here from Dave Coble, he talks about, again, self-defense, resistance to tyranny. He says some people feared forcible resistance to tyranny because it would lead to chaos. And in his book, Sidney argued the opposite. He said you would have more stability. It's kind of like how Jefferson at one point said, a little revolution every now and then is a good thing. It reminds the people in power that the people in power are not them. It's actually somebody else. It is a check on government. Sidney, Dave writes, was a militia enthusiast. He recognized that it was up to the common people to defend their rights. They can't rely on others. That's why that whole notion of relying on the will of one single person, that's slavery. So if you are relying on them, you have to be able to protect yourself when they don't do the good thing or don't do the right thing, or if you don't want to live in slavery. He was a militia enthusiast, used many examples from ancient Greece and Rome and from more recent European history to show that a militia fighting for its freedom would defeat mercenaries interested merely in pay. And Dave goes on, he says, without a natural right of self-defense, society itself would cease to exist. We're often told that a country requires this or that. You have to have a strong military or borders or whatever, ability to have back doors on surveillance to be able to find out who bad guys are. Without this, you can't. But really, what Sidney was saying is you have to base it on a right to self-defense. And Samuel Adams talked about this in 1772 as well. He talked about the natural rights of the people plus the ability under nature to defend those rights. And here's how Sidney put it. He says, nay, all laws must fall. Human societies that subsist by them must be dissolved, and all innocent persons be exposed to the violence of the most wicked. If men might not justly defend themselves against injustice by their own natural right. It's not a Second Amendment right. It's not a constitutional right. The Second Amendment isn't your gun permit. You have a right to keep and bear arms, to defend yourself, your home, your person, your property, your family, because you are a person by your birthright. It doesn't matter where you were born, when you were born. We all have this. It's just a matter of how much a government at the time that we might live under might want to restrict it. It's up to the people to learn how to exercise their rights, whether government wants us to or not. He says, if men might not justly defend themselves against injustice by their own natural right, when the ways prescribed by public authority cannot be taken. So he says, go to the process that's set up under the government, but if you can't defend yourself that way, you have your natural right of self-defense. Here's a few other quotes from the sections here. 17, kings cannot be the interpreters of the oaths they take. This is a precursor to the notion, and you might hear me talk about this, if you rely on the federal government today to define the limits of its own power, you shouldn't be surprised when that power continually grows and grows and grows. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they warned about this in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. Madison as well pointed this out in his famous Report of 1800, explaining that. He even said that the judicial department could be oppressive. So if you're looking to the various branches of the federal government to magically limit their own power, then you're going to have a lot of power over and over. And that's the same type of message. It's broader than this. But if a king is the interpreter of what their oath means, then the king or the people in power are going to manipulate that to fit their own needs and to fit their own expansion of power over time. Here from section 11, this is precursor to nullification as well. That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed. That's what Patrick Henry said in response to the Stamp Act of 1765. Any taxes imposed by the far-off government, not enacted by our own assembly here, you are not bound to obey them. John Adams argued the same. John Dickinson argued the same. If you comply with the act, he said, you are riveting perpetual chains around your unhappy country. Here he is again in section 20. Unjust commands are not to be obeyed, and no man is obliged to suffer for not obeying such as are against law. And just one more to wrap it up here from Samuel Adams. We just sent out an email highlighting this great speech on American independence, which he gave at the State House in Philadelphia, I believe, August 1st, 1776. We think of July 4th as Declaration Day, but really it wasn't ratified and signed until August 2nd by most people, and someone even much, much later. But it wasn't signed until August 2nd, so Samuel Adams gave a very powerful speech the day before talking about it. And he said, this day we are called upon to give a glorious example of what the wisest and best of men were rejoiced to view only in speculation. So he's looking through history. What is our American tradition? What are the principles that we base our tradition and our views on, our revolution, our independence? They only got to speculate, to think about it in theory, but today, this is a glorious day because we are putting those principles finally, after 100+ years, into practice. He says, millions of freemen deliberately and voluntarily forming themselves into a society for their common defense and common happiness, immortal spirits of Hampden, Locke, and Sidney. So there, Samuel Adams as well, along with his cousin John, Jefferson, Franklin, so many others, looked to Algernon Sidney as one of the leading thinkers of the American Revolution. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, and I hope you enjoyed this information as much as I enjoyed putting it together and sharing it with you. As I read more and more of his book, I'll probably share more on that over time. And if you like this kind of founder's recipe stuff, this concept that I got from Joe Wolverton, and you want to learn more about the founder's influences as I learn about them, because I'm really just kind of taking this up myself. As I learn more about them, if you like it, let me know. I will share as I go, kind of like what I'm doing with Brutus and the Anti-Federalist Papers. As I learn and I get a better understanding of these things, I want to share the information with you. Well, if you enjoyed the show, I will look over in the live chat here in just a moment. If you enjoyed the show, please do a few free, easy things to help me spread the word because it triggers the algorithm of the platforms. Reviews on Apple Podcasts help a ton. So does smashing a like leaving comments in the archive, sharing links, getting notifications, subscribing, places like YouTube, etc. All that stuff triggers the algorithm. It tells the platform to show the program to more people. Of course, our membership program, $2 a month is where it starts over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Taking a quick look over at the live chat, see if there's anything interesting to look at. Here's Haji, 1954. Sidney's writings certainly have relevance for us today, without a doubt, especially the concept of compliance. The idea that we have to wait on government to tell us that it's okay, that something that government did, government shouldn't have done, and now we don't have to comply with it. The founding generation didn't think you just would willy-nilly refuse to comply with anything and everything. You had to have strategic thought. But if you had this doctrine of unlimited submission, of constant obedience, James Otis, Thomas Jefferson, and so many others told us this is what is a destruction of liberty. There's no reason for government to stop if they don't think that there's a check on what they can do. So as we continue to comply, as John Dickinson warned on the Stamp Act, if you comply with the act, you rivet chains, perpetual chains around your unhappy country. So certainly relevant. My Cat Food said, I love this stuff. Okay, cool. I really enjoy this too as well. Erwin Havernick, same thing. I appreciate you guys enjoying this. I'm glad you guys find it interesting. You guys are the smartest community on you. I watch a lot of YouTube. I listen to a lot of podcasts throughout the day. Some of it's really deep and interesting stuff. Some of it's really kind of just fluff to listen to in the background. But as I look through live chat on stuff and I watch live streams or look at comment threads, I never see better comments than in this community. Probably because you guys are interested in stuff that I am, but I'm so grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Erwin Havernick says resist, and that's a word that I think we need to keep reminding people of. Again, I will look in the chat and see if there's any more comments that I can reply to a little bit later today. You can also email me with ideas and questions over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you learned something more important than anything. I hope you got something educational. I will link to all the stuff that I talked about, including a full text of this book, Discourses, so you can read it in full on your own time over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.